think we're going to go ahead and get started. First off, I wanted to say welcome to the inaugural Distinguished Entrepreneur Speaker event hosted by the Polsky Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation at the University of Chicago and the Chicago Booth School of Business. My name is Lucas Peralta. The Distinguished Entrepreneur Speaker Series, which we're excited to share with you, was created to allow successful serial entrepreneurs and investors to share inspirational stories and lessons learned in their careers with the UChicago community. Thank you to our partner, Chicago Booth alum, Manish Kothari, who is a successful serial entrepreneur himself and who was instrumental in the creation of this series. Additional speakers in the series will be announced soon, and we are excited to share future details with you. With all that said, I'm happy to introduce you to Manish Kothari, who will in turn introduce you to the participants of today's Fireside Chat.
Thank you, Lucas, and welcome everyone. I hope you, your friends and families are doing well during these times. The idea and inspiration for the speaker series actually was born out of a conversation that I had with Dean Rajan during the summer of last year. And in that conversation, we actually outlined a couple of objectives that we felt are core to the speaker series. The first is to host a serial and exemplary entrepreneur once a quarter or so, and do so in a fireside chat format that would allow student participation and audience participation with ample time for Q&A. The second is to really encourage a wider community, including those from other disciplines, not just the business school. And this we feel pretty strongly because it bears emphasizing that the fundamental belief that was driving that objective has to do with the thought that great teams and great ideas often come through the cross-pollination of diverse disciplines and ideas. And that's why we felt it would be great to attract students from across all disciplines and audiences. Thank you, Dean Rajan, for indulging the idea. And I have a special thanks for the folks at the Polsky Center, including Lucas and the marketing team, for doing all the heavy lifting. This has taken quite a bit of planning, and they have done a lot of great work. It is now my honor to introduce our first speaker, Doug Becker. I have known Doug for almost 25 years, and to me, he embodies the characteristics of an exemplary entrepreneur. He is perseverant, he is bold when needed, he's actually balanced even during challenging times, and he has this great ability to mix, and has a great mix, I should say, of being a very astute business person and a caring human being. Among entrepreneurs and I think venture capitalists, there is often a joke that says that it is harder to found an education startup than it is a healthcare startup. So I don't know which one ranks as being sort of the harder one to found and start and grow. But Doug has successfully started not just one education company, but three. And he has co-founded an investment firm as well. He co-founded Sylvan Learning. When we had first met him, he was with Sylvan Learning. And that grew to over 1,000 centers as a private tutoring business, and the largest one that served over 200,000 students in North America for kindergarten through 12th grade students. He then co-founded a higher education company called Laureate Education that grew to being the largest private higher education university or institution in the world, serving over 1 million students. And he's taken all those learnings and co-founded recently a company called Santana, which focuses on bringing all those lessons into making learning and higher ed learning especially more affordable and accessible to students. He also co-founded an investment firm called Sterling Partners that has made more than 80 investments across various business sectors. And he serves on several boards, including that for the School of Medicine at Johns Hopkins and the International Youth Foundation. Doug, thank you so much for taking the time to join us, and welcome. And now I'll hand it over to Dean Rajan and to you.
Hey, thank you. First of all, thank you very much to the Polsky Center for setting up this event. We were going to do this in person back in the spring, and of course had to postpone it. And I wanted to thank Manish for taking the initiative to propose this idea, carry it through fruition. So we're very excited that we are beginning this venture, and we look forward to everything that's to come. Doug, thank you for being the inaugural participant in this fireside chat format. Let me start by asking where you are and what you've been doing the last 6 months.
Thank you. And I'm really excited to be here. It's nice to have any break in the routine. Zoom is the routine, but usually my Zoom topics are something different than this. And I'm a big fan of Booth and UFC, and so I'm really glad to participate. And Manish and his brother are good friends after all these years. So I live in Colorado. I used to travel literally 5 days a week all over the world from here. I've lived in a lot of different places, but found myself here during COVID. And of course, like many, just planted my roots here and learned that we can still get so much done no matter where we are. And that's what I've continued to do. So worried for the world, trying to do what I can to help, but also continuing to progress with the ventures and investments and backing other entrepreneurs despite this challenging time.
Let me go back to your background maybe, and then we can talk about your philosophy. As Manish mentioned, you co-founded both an investment firm and educational firms on their own. What's sort of the connection between Sterling on the one hand and your educational ventures on the other hand?
Sure. Well, actually, they all originate from an entrepreneurial venture that I came up with. I was 17 years old, so I don't really know how that was possible. And developed a healthcare technology. I wanted to be a doctor. I was a computer hobbyist. I came up with a technology for automating medical records, which actually still doesn't seem like it's been done properly after all these years. Ended up starting a business, brought in my brother and two of our closest friends. And that's where the Chicago Nexus originates. And started this company. Was able to get a deferral from undergraduate studies. My parents had been excited to hear that I'd gotten into Harvard, and then I ended up deferring for a year and another year, and then they said, you have to come or reapply, and I didn't go. And so actually my partners and I, we started as entrepreneurs. And then within a few years after our partner in that entity, which was the Blue Cross and Blue Shield insurance system, they acquired our company from us. I was 19. Wasn't thinking of myself as a business person or an investor. I just wanted to I had a burning desire to create a product that would help people. So I had to be dragged kicking and screaming into selling this company because I wanted to do it for the rest of my life. But I got some great advice from my older brother, who's also a UFC, was a student at the time, and which was to remember that this partner who was generously offering to buy us out was also our source of funding. So he just made that point to me. We sold the business, took the proceeds, and created what today people would call sort of a little family office. I don't even think that expression existed back then. And we just started looking for interesting investments. And just to make a long story short, I quickly came upon the idea that the same passion that I had around the human and social aspect of health and technology could actually be applied to education, despite the fact that I didn't have very much. And that's from there how we went forward. And we started this investment company. Eventually, two of my partners took that entity and made it into its own enterprise, raising third-party capital. And one of the partners and I went off to actually start what became a series of education companies. And but we remained partners, all of us, for what's now been more than 30 years.
And have you been always in the US doing this? I mean, we think of Sylvan as being an American and your other ventures, but have you always lived in the US?
You know, actually, at some point, my work took me to the rest of the world, and I discovered a great passion for the rest of the world and for learning other cultures and meeting and making friends around the world and asking questions in the way that you learn to do when you're reorienting yourself. So actually, I relocated with my fiance, and then with my family. We lived in Europe, we lived in Asia, and I ended up traveling more than maybe anyone other than an airline pilot and so lived and worked all over the world. And then as a result, I'd say that really has become my specialty, has been looking for ideas that can be applied on a global basis.
So if you think back to the success you've had with Sylvan and then with Laureate, one of the things that, particularly with Laureate, was that you set it up as a B-Corp, right? And at some point, it was the largest such company in the world. Could you just explain to people why you chose to do that? First of all, what does it mean? And then why did you do that?
So Laureate actually, long into the process, the B Corp and the what's called a public benefit corporation, I'll briefly explain, they really didn't exist when we started. And I'll tell you about that. So essentially a public benefit corporation, the idea was first approved in Maryland. That was then my home state and actually where I was born. And I remember reading what an interesting idea, that while we were used to there being a nonprofit corporation and a for-profit corporation, now there would be something in the middle that would be a for-profit corporation, but with very, very specified obligations around measurable social, positive social impact. And so that's a legal structure. But very quickly, people who were looking at that legal structure were also looking for a way to have third-party validation that a company that had that legal structure was living up to its obligations. And that's what the B Corp is. It is a measurement tool, basically an assessment or an accreditation as to whether a company is in fact living up to its obligations. And they give you a numeric score, not an easy thing to do, that summarizes how you impact the community that you serve, the environment, your workforce, your customers, et cetera. And so I was fascinated by it. But at that time, when I went to my general counsel and said, let's go do this, he said to me, you know, it's really, there's a lot of holes in the model that could create big litigation risks. It was not conceived for companies of our size. I think when it first came out, we had probably just crossed $1 billion of revenue at Laureate. I think that might have been around 2007, if I remember right. And so we just kept working on it. We would go to the state of Maryland and say, you need to change this, you need to change that, or no big company, and certainly no public company will ever adopt it. And we then went private actually in 2007, which gave me the possibility to eventually adopt this. And so we ended up finally getting to a point where we were able to convince not my own state of Maryland, but our neighbor state of Delaware to make what we thought were very thoughtful adjustments. And they came out with a code that worked for us. So we became I want to say around 2015 or 16, we became both a public benefit corporation and a certified B Corp, and then went public. And so at the time that we became a PBC, we were definitely the largest. I think the next nearest companies would be companies like Ben & Jerry's and Patagonia, who actually were the pioneers in this space. And then we were the first public company to go public as a PBC, as a public benefit corporation. So, and then the last point very quickly, I would say is, for me, I mentioned from the beginning that social impact was very important to me. Maybe, Manish, the reason why starting education and healthcare companies is so hard is that these are not companies, these are not just businesses. And society really won't tolerate a purely mercantile approach to business when you have a social or civic purpose of this importance. And so in a way, what the PBC and the B Corp gave me was a framework to be able to organize my whole company around achieving these goals, proving that we achieve these goals, submitting ourselves to the scrutiny of outside evaluation. And that was a breakthrough for me and really important to me.
In many ways, would you say that the whole ESG movement, that you were sort of doing ESG before we had ESG in some sense?
Yes, and in fact, ESG it certainly predated, and that expression was earlier. You know, first I think people talked about CSR, sort of corporate social responsibility, but then very quickly saw that it could be somewhat self-serving, and people started using the expression greenwashing if you were pretending that you were environmentally sustainable, et cetera. And then ESG began to come with frameworks, with third-party measurement. And then in many ways, B Corp is a combination of a brand to try to motivate consumers to buy from responsible companies, and also a very rigorous measurement framework, which, by the way, was not designed for education institutions. So we were, in addition to all those other firsts, the first university to have to go through this, and that required them to adapt their measurement framework as well. So, but it's been, I'd say the thing I'm most proud of is to have been even a small part of a movement that really could be summarized by saying that business is a force for good, or business can be a force for good. But I know you know this, that is hardly the general perception of business. And we have a lot of work to do to try to propagate that with facts and reality.
Your new company, Santana, which Manish mentioned, that is a BCorp as well.
It is.
And it seems a bit different from the others in that here with the new firm, you're actually trying to partner with existing universities. So could you explain sort of why the transition?
Absolutely. And interesting, the origin of the name, it's actually a Sanskrit origin word that means thinking and planning. And it would be said Santana. Most people are saying Santana, so thank you for that. I think there are only 50,000 people that speak Sanskrit left, but I know a lot of the Indian languages share similar words. So that is the company we created. And whereas Laureate, we were able to identify incredibly powerful tools to help universities grow with quality. But we applied those tools mostly by acquiring private universities that we could own. And while that went very well, and I'm incredibly proud of what we did and what my colleagues and friends are still doing at Laureate, which is still a large company, I always wondered what we could do with a partnering model instead of an acquisition model. Many of the best universities in many countries are nonprofit institutions that would never conceive of being acquired. And therefore, we weren't able to always bring the resource set that certainly from my experience that I learned at Laureate to these type of affiliated institutions. And that's what Santana does. We started it in partnership with a university, which is Arizona State, very ambitious, innovative, powerful institution that wants to reach out to the world. And that's what we're doing now, finding partner universities that want to grow. And I should mention, since of course, as a school of business, you're thinking about the role of business, private universities are still a very small part of the equation in many countries around the world. There are countries in which there are no private universities. There are countries in which the only few might be religious-oriented institutions from, the Jesuit tradition or whatever. And so the idea of a private non-sectarian institution, forget whether it's for-profit or nonprofit, but one in which there's little or no government support and in which you need to build a scalable institution that's funded off of the tuition and you have to charge a reasonable fee in order to get any students. I felt there was something very healthy about that model. It wouldn't work unless it was working for everyone. And that's what we did at Laureate, and now that's what we're doing with many more institutions in the Santana network.
And so I assume that there are institutions outside the US as well that you're working with, and sort of broadly how many?
Yes. Well, we're actually just starting. So we just had our 1-year anniversary, and the model entails a very big commitment on the part of a partnering institution. So, and also we have to make sure we pick the right partner. I mean, the beauty of the Laureate model was when we acquired something, it was ours to do with as we saw fit, as long as we were respecting what society and regulators needed. But now convincing others to join our journey without being bound together through common ownership, that's much harder. So we actually have just, in the past, I'd say 30 days, signed our first 2 partners out of what is envisioned to be as many as 100 around the world. And now great acceleration because many of these institutions are seeing, of course, among other things, the movement towards online and a great urgency to survive and thrive in the post-COVID world. But we're not actually anticipating having any affiliates in the US unless they are for the purpose of creating content that's shared, like what we do with ASU. So we think of ASU as offering brand and content in the way that UFC could. And then, so like a sending institution, and then we think of these other institutions as receiving institutions that want to share best practices, content, brand, and other affiliations.
So do you have an exclusivity arrangement with ASU, or this was just a business sort of decision?
We do, but it's exclusive in that they've agreed not to do this with someone else, and they actually are shareholders in the company, which for through an affiliate they have called Enterprise Partners, which is pretty unusual for a public institution, but makes sense. They're an incredibly bold and innovative and ambitious institution, and they've been wonderful. But we will work with other institutions of their type as we go around the world and understand better what people need. But they've been a great partner to start with. And first and foremost, we're focused on weaving them into the fabric of these partnerships. And in fact, the first of these partnerships will be announced just in the next couple of weeks. A Latin American institution that would be the largest private institution in its home country that will be the first to carry the expression powered by ASU. And of course, a part of the Santana network.
So I just want to tell the audience to send in questions through the Q&A button on the bottom, and so I'll curate and ask questions to Doug as you send them in. Let me go back to your entrepreneurial journey, Doug. One of the things that happens with somebody like you who's been very successful, the notion is to think that everything has been just great from the beginning.
Oof.
That been the case with your career?
Yeah, hardly the case. I mean, it's really amazing amazing to me that any of our companies ever survived. Starting with the fact that I started with no experience or training to do anything. Although that gave me an incredible opportunity to ask for mentors and to work with people that knew what they were doing so well, and I could bring an idea or passion, a desire to learn, maybe almost a spiritual guideline around the importance of social impact. But that was it. I didn't know how to do anything. And then, so that was really interesting. I'll just give you a very quick story about how badly this can start. After we sold our first company, which was the healthcare technology company, my partners and I acquired our first education company, tiny little company. If you can imagine, the product was, among other things, we made systems that would train people on Morse code. So now Morse code, I don't think even exists anymore. But we had other products as well. And we acquired this company. I went to visit the company. I met two salespeople. One handled the east half of the United States. The other handled the western half of the United States. I went in the back. There was somebody working in the warehouse, one person. There was no accounting department. There was no marketing department. There was so much missing. And we came to realize that the company we had bought this from, which was a big parent company, did all of those functions up at the parent company. So not only did we not have those capabilities, but we had not even built those costs into the model of acquiring that business. Strike one. Strike two, our product was mostly for the US government purpose. We bought this company in January. We learned that at midnight on December 31st, that company was dropped from the list, the GSA schedule, which allows government agencies to buy off-the-shelf products. So we lost about half of our revenue just in the first few weeks. And then we discovered that of our corporate customers, one of them accounted for about half of the remaining half of our business. They felt that they actually should have been offered the chance to buy the company, and they sued us and dropped us as a customer, as a supplier. So literally, we lost 3/4 of our revenues in the first few weeks of owning this company, inherited a lawsuit from a multi-billion-dollar company. And I just give you that as an example. I hope to inspire people that you can be hopelessly ill-prepared and maybe survive. Secondly, though, that you can, with perseverance, usually you get a chance to work your way through these problems. And that company ultimately, through an indirect route, became Sylvan, which became eventually a very successful publicly traded company. So just one anecdote, but there's so many. And I like to think of my list of what I've learned mostly revolves around the things that didn't work, with just a few sprinklings of the things that we could say, wow, that we really nailed it on that one. Usually not so much.
Mm-hmm. And what was the transition from Sylvan to Laurier?
We acquired it. It was a $10 million revenue company. It was losing money. It was a franchise network of tutoring centers. And then we took it public after we're $18 million of revenue. We took it public, which I think actually in retrospect was a terrible idea, but there were reasons why we thought it was a good idea. But it took off. And what I learned was first that there was a movement towards consumers actually making investment decisions around spending money on education. And that is an insight in and of itself, because we still tend to get most of our education often from public education. I started at public school myself as a elementary school student, and you just don't make decisions. You go to the school that you're assigned to. And so Sylvan was one of the early pioneers in providing a supplemental service, and parents could make a choice and say, I want this for my kid. So I started thinking about other spin-off or related education ideas that would revolve around brand, would revolve around marketing, would revolve around replication to scale. We ended up with 250,000 students at any given time enrolled in Sylvan at 1,000 locations. So our ability to make sure that we were diagnosing a kid with the same education need in Wyoming as we did in Toronto or Boston. So these replicable, scalable systems became a hallmark of everything that I did for the rest of my career. Then our next big scalable idea was a company called Prometric, where we used the daytime empty hours of the Sylvan centers to deliver secure exams, like the GMAT, for example. That was one of our first customers. And that's when testing went from fill in the bubble, take the test 5 times a year, to go into a center, take a secure examination on the day of your choice and get your score instantly. Wow, that was definitely one of the coolest things I ever had a chance to work with. We later sold that company. Eventually it became owned by the company called Educational Testing Services, ETS. And then Laureate was the third. And the story of Laureate is that I was out setting up TOEFL testing centers for our testing business. And I was in Beijing right when the US government bombed the Chinese embassy maybe it was in Kosovo, I'm not sure, but it was a disaster. And so I saw people demonstrating in front of the US embassy in Beijing, and on the other side of the embassy, an unending line of people waiting to get a visa to come into the United States to go to study. And that opened my eye, that plus just the numbers of people taking the TOEFL exam, opened my eyes to say, why can't we offer some sort of good, replicable education experience for people who can't afford to leave their country, but want something great? And that's how Laureate was born. That was around 1999.
So maybe just some issue with the sound, Doug. I'm not sure if your earphones are running out of battery or whatever.
We'll see what happens.
Okay, yeah, that's much better actually. So
were you able to hear my answer?
Yeah, I did. I was able to hear. Thank you. So I'll go to a couple of the questions and then come back with others. So one of the questions is, how do you see consolidation with respect to brands, if at all, in the higher ed space? Do you feel that smaller and less well-known institutions will have to become franchises powered by, as Santana is facilitating, sort of a satellite of a bigger brand?
Interesting. In most of the countries we're operating in, so the context outside of the United States, there still is typically an imbalance of supply and demand. There may be what appears to be a balance, but when you look underneath, everybody gets into college, but they may wish to go to engineering school and they end up admitted to business school, or they're admitted to a university that's 1,000 miles away, or. And I would say when you cut through it, certainly in emerging markets, there is still an imbalance of supply and demand. So in that sense, what we're doing is more capacity building and not consolidation, or maybe keeping people from having to consolidate. In the US, it's quite a different matter. Now there are many, many subscale small institutions that are really suffering. And they were suffering before COVID, and they were suffering from a demographic downdrift. They were suffering from their ability to really have a right to win in terms of product and brand. And in that case, I think there'll be some consolidation, but I also think there will just be, unfortunately, closures, which we read about in many cases, where it's just not needed anymore in that sense. And of course, online contributes to that, because you can get, and online is not for every discipline and not for every student, but you can get something anywhere through online that you might otherwise have expected was only available through a local supplier. So in that sense, it's definitely going to be a very tough road ahead. And many people anticipate at least a quarter of the US colleges and universities will end up going out of business over the next maybe decade. And I think that's probably right.
To what extent do you, are your teachings done through online? I mean, is that something you invested in before? Where do you see that sort of going, your own investments?
It's a great question. You know, in Laureate, one of our biggest successes was a fully online university, mostly focused on the US, called Walden, which was the first fully online university focusing only on graduate studies, master's and doctoral programs. I remember people would say to me, there's just not enough addressable market. Why would you ever do that? Walden ended up with 50,000 students, and you know, quite for what it is, quite an, I believe, an outstanding institution, and not a research-based institution in the same way, of course, like a UFC would be, but serving a different population of nurses and educators and people that are balancing family and home, and a pioneer in online. So I would go from a Monday where I'd be at a Walden meeting. This would be 15, almost 20 years ago. We acquired Walden at less than 1,000 students in the year 2000, so 20 years ago. And then the next day I would be going to places like Mexico or Turkey or India or Brazil. And there was not only no online, there was no interest in online. Regulators didn't believe in it. Employers didn't believe in it. Families and students didn't believe in it. And in that sense, it reminded me of what the US had been maybe 10 years previously. I have to remind people, because I guess I'm old enough now to do it, that when I started my work with Walden, that it was not legal for a university to deliver all of its curriculum in the US online if you were in the Title IV government loan and grant program. And so Walden applied and became one of only 25 universities that were the pioneers that were given the waiver to be able to teach fully online. Wow. So, but then nothing outside the United States. And I had a very hard time getting people to pay attention. And I would, even in my own company, I would say to them, look, you know, I'm the ghost of Christmas future. I just traveled here from the US where this is just taking off because it's creating choices for working professionals that don't exist in their market. And eventually the way I was able to crack the code on that was to just insist that all of our universities around the year 2014, I did something I really never did in my work as a CEO, which was something that was really an edict. And I said, every university must, as long as their regulators permit it, must get to the point where at least 25% of the teaching hours that they're teaching are done by online. So if that's because some of the students are fully online and the rest are not, this was a muscle building exercise. And amazingly, we got there. And some universities got to 35%, and some universities, regulators wouldn't permit it. But on average, we got there. And then it's very interesting, in the middle of COVID, I got a note from one of the leaders at Laureate just saying, you know, what you did all those years ago actually readied us to literally flip a switch on a system with 70 universities and 1 million students and go online overnight. And I felt so happy about that, to think that groundwork had been laid and was really important. And now we're seeing online embraced everywhere. You take China right after the outbreak, one day they brought 200 million students online. Obviously not easily. I'm sure they would think not well. It was an emergency. And at that moment, the rest of us were all living in a fantasy where we thought this was just a China issue in terms of public health. But boy, did that open my eyes as to what the future now holds, how mindset will change, obviously from rooted in a terrible, terrible affliction, but now opening opportunities for students all over the world.
So if you fast forward then, Doug, do you see that after COVID, we go back to what used to be, or do you feel like this is a trend that's going to continue, the online trend?
I don't think it will ever go back. And honestly, I don't think it would have. I think the inexorable trend would have been towards online, again, mostly with a focus on working adults. You know, I don't think that online is going to be the education of choice for a lot of 17 and 18-year-olds who are looking for a lot more out of their degree than just the degree. And they're looking for career guidance, and maybe they're looking for pastoral care. And, you know, Laureate, our biggest market was Mexico. In Mexico, there's a tradition for kids to go to high school on a university campus because parents felt that it was safer and because kids felt that it prepared them better to go to university. Half of all high school students in the country of Mexico go to high school on a university campus. And I say that to illustrate how that a university education can mean so many different things to so many people. In Turkey, a university degree means a deferral from mandatory military service or the ability to enter the military as an officer. So online just needs to be looked at as a very powerful tool in that context of what people want and need. I think it was inexorable, but I believe it has been accelerated to a drastic level by what we've all just gone through or are going through with COVID.
Okay. We have a couple of questions getting at an issue that I think is sort of important to you. First question, would you mind sharing your thoughts on how to alleviate disparity in education?
It's a great question. And, alleviating disparity, period. First, I think if you can do it in education, you can really have a good head start on improving the disparity that we see all over the world. And since so much of my work has been outside of the US, I've worked in some of the poorest countries in the world, in Africa, in Honduras, in, just places where people are struggling to survive. And I saw what education did for people in those countries. At Laureate, our average tuition was less than $4,000 a year. Now, in poor countries, it was less than that because that's an average. But it still was something that maybe only the top third of the income of society could afford, but it still gave people choices. Families that used to send one kid to university could now afford to send two. I would hear a story like that and, be choked up to think, I can't even imagine someone who has to decide which of their kids gets to go to college. By the way, even though I didn't go, but I think about just how well rooted that was into my family framework, the expectations, how hard my parents worked so that I should have gone. And so, yes, I do believe that this is the most powerful force for justice and equality that we can imagine in the world. And technology is going to get at the root of the issue in education, which is affordability. But affordability requires a transformation in how things are done. You can have online, but still have every course handmade by every professor. Nothing wrong with that, by the way, but that's not a scalable model. And it doesn't necessarily take costs out of the model. And at some institutions, that's not the problem. But if the goal is equality, that is the problem. And when you hear about free education, I find this very interesting in the US political dimension, a lot of focus on free education. And I get called by, the advisors to all of these presidential candidates. And I say to them, first of all, there is no such thing as free education. Somebody's paying for it. What you're trying to say is free to the user, as opposed to something that today has very high user fees. And then to recognize that the high user fees is why so many people in the US gets to access education. And if you take those fees away, then the government will be in the business of rationing education. So it's a very complicated factor around politics, around funding, who pays. But in the end, my goal, and I hope my contribution will be, breakthrough ideas that bring the cost down, and then who pays becomes less important because everybody can benefit from that.
So we have a similar question which says, do you believe, going to the cost part, do you believe there will be a shift ever away from cost drivers such as high-end dorms, fancy cafeterias, large sports stadiums, so on and so forth, to decrease the cost of the in-person experience?
Sure. I mean, look, my work at Laureate, 95% of our students were outside of the United States. And guess what? We didn't have any of those things. We did have, we had a few dorms, not many. We had a few sports facilities, nothing fancy, because that's not what our customer, who was so, as I say, these were parents trying to decide which of their kids they could afford to go. They didn't want us to do that. They wanted a great education that was affordable. And I used to have to make hard choices. Like I would look at that B-Lab score, the BCorp score, and we never got as good of a score on the environment as I wanted. Because when I looked at if I took my university in Manaus at that time at Laureate in the Amazon and put solar power panels on the roof, what that would cause me to have to charge my customer was not something that they wanted or could afford. Well, that was not what I was hoping for. I wanted to have it all. I wanted to not only give everybody the affordable education they wanted and please my shareholders, but also to be the most environmentally aware and responsible institution. And we just couldn't do it all. Such hard choices out there. The US, look, the reason why you see expensive dorms and sports facilities and everything is because we have a funding mechanism that pays for it and allows universities to charge more than most people wish that it costs. And that goes to the government loan program. That is why people, for example, coming back from the military 50 years ago, were able to all become educated. But that was when it might cost $3,000 or $4,000 to get a degree instead of $100,000 or more. And that system has permitted inflation in the same way that inexpensive mortgage financing allowed real estate prices for homes to spiral out of control and create the last great economic crisis. Mm-hmm. So it's a very complicated factor. There are premium brands, certainly UFC would be one, that people will find a way to pay for no matter how expensive it is, and it is worth it. But we know that that's a very unusual and rare case amongst the majority of people going. There are 200 million people in higher education in the world, and basically 90% of them go to universities that you would never even have heard of, that nobody would have ever heard of if they don't live in that town. Doesn't mean they're bad, by the way, but they're not ranked. They don't show up in the incredible rankings or anything like that.
Mm-hmm. A couple of questions about the experiences you've had. One says the education sector is regulated, sort of like healthcare, and in many cases, universities are state-owned. I guess you've had to work with bureaucrats and overcome a number of hurdles, particularly as you think about emerging markets and so on. Can you share some of these experiences?
Sure. There's no doubt. One of the things that made what we did so hard was regulation. And I made it harder by dreaming that we could do things that people told me were impossible. Our very first university we acquired was in Spain. This is 1999. When I went there, nobody had ever acquired a university. They were mostly, private universities were mostly religious institutions affiliated. Only 4 non-sectarian universities. We had to get a constitutional scholar to make an opinion for the government that you could even acquire a university. Wow. Then when we owned that university, I went to our team and I said, we should open a medical school. And they said, well, no new medical school in Madrid has been licensed in 25 years. That's impossible. I learned one of the most important lessons in my life. Impossible means something that costs too much in time or money than the average person can bear. And of course, the end of that story, 7 years later, we opened our medical school, became one of the best in Spain. And then one day we wanted to open a new university in Australia. One of my good friends came to me and said, there are only 3 at that time private universities in Australia, only around 40 universities total in the country, kind of amazing. And no new universities in almost 30 years. We went in, we got the only university license to be granted, even since then, created a beautiful, very dynamic, technology-enhanced university. So my point is, if you have the staying power, the stubbornness, the support that you need, and you do need a lot of credibility with regulators. We spent a lot of time connecting with regulators to have them understand what we were doing, why they should like it, why it was quality, why it was good for students. We took in an investment from the World Bank to prove that we could withstand that ESG scrutiny that you were talking about. And they made, through their IFC investing arm, the biggest investment in education they'd ever made. Well, imagine what that said to these governments around the world, that when we would show up and say, why don't you allow any online? And then to earn their trust, we would say things like, you should allow online, but you should regulate it very strictly. And people would say, well, why don't you want us to be more lax in our regulation? And we would say, that would actually just hurt the trust that people have in what we're trying to do. And that's how we built trust, was never going in just for what was in it for us, but trying to go in with a thinking for the long term and earning the trust of our constituents, especially regulators, who often really didn't believe that they had any reason to trust us or any other profit-making enterprise.
So this question kind of builds on that. You've had, as you mentioned, a lot of setbacks. Life wasn't always sort of smooth. The entrepreneurial path wasn't that smooth. In light of the challenges you mentioned, some of it seemed insurmountable. Were there any frameworks you used to think about what's the critical path to bouncing back from these setbacks?
I'd say there are a couple things. One is I always relied on people, and whether that was emotional support, mentors, advisors. I mean, one of the beautiful things when I was 17, started a business, is anybody would be open to mentoring somebody really young who needs it. In the same reason that educators, Dean, like you, do what you do for a living. And by the way, when you're 40 and you ask for somebody to mentor you, you're not quite as cute. It's a little bit harder to get somebody to take the time. And so I always say to younger people, go get mentors while they find what you're doing compelling and they know how to help you. By the way, by the time I was 40, I was dealing with problems where some of my first mentors probably would have said, they'd throw up their hands and say, hey, boy, I didn't see that one coming. So using mentors, building incredible teams, hiring people who knew how to do things I never knew how to do, always challenging myself. I, at one point when I was, I don't know, maybe 30, was asked to go on the board of a company that eventually became what is now Exelon, big Chicago company. Nobody of my age had ever been on that board. And I went there. That was my MBA, by the way, was being on that board. And so educating myself constantly. And then I guess the other thing I would just recommend is I was always a big fan of rolling averages. I have friends and I talk to them and they would say, oh, I just hired so-and-so. That person's going to be a star. And I would say, we'll see. And then somebody else would say, oh, so-and-so who works for me just made a terrible mistake. They're terrible. I should get rid of them. And I would say, we'll see. I wanted everyone to have the same benefit I had gotten, which was I was never made or broken by any one moment in my life. And therefore I always wanted, and I got that opportunity. There are other people who were broken by a mistake that they made in their life. And so I tried to give people the chance to demonstrate on rolling averages. And that was my mindset. So when things seemed so terrible, one of my former CFOs who went off to become very successful, and a good friend, I would go sit in his office at some of the most grim moments. And I would say, he would say, what do you think? And I would say, it's not worth dying for. Because the stress was such, you could literally imagine just having a stroke. Mm-hmm. And that was something I just tried to always take a deep breath. And I found, like, family, my kids, my son is now in high school, my daughter's in college, but, so much of my life, coming home to my kids, my daughter, when she was probably 7, she would listen to all my business calls. And then when I would hang up, she would say, EBITDA, blah, blah, blah. And that was such a great lesson. Like, she didn't care about EBITDA. By the way, now I think she's beginning to see the beauty in EBITDA. But at that time, she wanted her dad. And I would also encourage you to do what you can to find a little bit of resiliency in having something in your life other than your business. I say that as somebody who didn't always do a good job of that, but boy, did I try.
So question, how would you guide people to think about the problem of achieving something noble like Duolingo is trying to do? I don't know if you know them, with providing a free product for learning languages versus, quote, selling out, unquote, and charging people or generating ad revenue. So how do you sort of, balance that?
It's a hard one. I mean, look, we were a BCorp at Laureate, and yet I had some investors who were very, very focused on ESG, like the World Bank, and I had other investors who themselves had investors they were accountable to. And you know what? They would just create a tremendous pressure to deliver short-term results. And I couldn't have done what I did without investor capital. And so I had to find a way to square the circle. And there were years, the way I would describe it is the board would come to me and say, we need another 100 basis points of margin. And I would say to them, you get 50. And the other 50, I need to hire more PhD faculty to make our universities better. And you know what? Most of the time, by having a board that saw that tending to reputation and image and trust and being trustworthy was actually worth multiple points, if not margin points, and inoculated against issues that put many of our competitors out of business in the for-profit sector. And people mostly supported me. I will say over time, I got tired of fighting that fight. And part of the Santana model being what it is today, and Santana being a company that my closest friends and I can be the majority shareholders in, that's important to me because I don't mind delivering good results to investors, but the pressure can become just warping on anyone. So it's a very tough thing. But what I would say is, unless it's a nonprofit entity, no matter how good their model, and I don't know much about Duolingo, I hear good things, but I guarantee you they have to deliver returns and value for shareholders. And if they don't, they're going to be a nonprofit model. And if I had set up Laureate as a nonprofit, we would have never scaled. We needed billions of dollars to go do what we did.
Mm-hmm. A couple of questions about online. Does Laureate invest in platform innovation like LMS, learning management systems and other things? And why is the user experience in online education lag the capabilities of mobile devices and cloud services?
It's a great question. So we never built our own technology. I mean, we often built our own kind of versions or implementations of a technology, and found a lot of value in that sort of, the skin that we would put over something to make it work better for our customers and our students. But we invested enormous amounts. I mean, the IT budget at Laureate when I was there, I want to say, was probably close to $200 million a year, maybe more. And that wasn't even related to online alone. That was everything to deal with 1 million students. So we learned a lot. I learned a lot about it. The technology was always trying to catch up. There were always issues that something great would exist, let's say here in the US, but it didn't work or wasn't supported someplace where we were trying to operate. So for a global company, I was always surprised. A lot of our technology suppliers actually really prized working with Laureate and now Santana, because they see us as being able to take them into countries and kind of force them to embrace the service and support that's needed in those countries. I think part of the reason why the user experience lags is that people are always integrating multiple systems. There really isn't one company that makes a system that does everything for everybody. And if they did, it wouldn't last very long. So you are in the integration business with online learning, whether you like it or not. Not if you have a completely isolated product like, let's say, language, maybe Duolingo. They can make everything themselves. But a full-on credit-bearing university degree delivered online, that is something that's going to require a lot of investment across platforms. And then lastly, I would say legacy. Legacy is a big issue, legacy systems. And so everyone is trying to find a way to integrate what they have with what they had and what they want. And that just slows people down. And it's really tough. It was an area where I would say I never felt like we got it right or that I got it right. I never felt that I spent enough time on it. I actually started as a computer programmer, self-taught, programmer in a language called Forth, which I don't even think exists anymore. So I think of myself as somebody who's pretty technologically aware, but I couldn't figure this out myself. I had great people. We stumbled along. We did a little better than everybody else that we were competing with. And in the end, I guess that was good enough. And then I look at somebody like ASU, who I work so closely with. They are doing incredible things with technology, still not easy and still very expensive. But they're getting closer to what I always envisioned I could have done at Laureate myself.
So again, on online, it's fascinating to see the greater access you get from online education. However, I feel employers value the online education less than a traditional on-campus education. What do you think we can do to change this perspective?
It's a great question. First of all, I would say I don't actually think that employers all feel that way. I think in the US, there's been now so much time and evidence on the efficacy of online learning, and it really is powerful. And I think it certainly has grabbed a lot of employers who see this not only as a great way to prepare for the workforce, but also a great way for them to help their own population of employees. You see, for example, Arizona State does this with Starbucks, where they now have, I don't know, more than 20,000 students taking online degrees, which is really amazing. So they view that as not just preparing their workforce, but also a benefit to their employees. And that's growing. I see that interest growing. I do think that there are some aspects of education that will be very hard to put online. At Laureate, we created from scratch 19 medical schools, if you can imagine. There was actually a guy, my friend Francisco, who opened 19 medical schools. Nobody in the world has ever done that. And medical education, it can be highly, highly improved with technology, but there are huge pieces of it that are predicated upon the clinical experience of being with patients. And I would argue the same in almost any profession. unless you can conduct it like day trading without leaving your home. So that's the other piece. If you want employers to take it seriously, make sure that you pick the right piece, your right place for where online education should operate. And so, for example, in medical education, teaching, biology, I think that can be done incredibly well with technology. I mean, even there's an incredible project I'm working on with ASU to create a virtual reality biology course. But be sure that those clinical rotations that medical students go through in hospitals should also be an incredibly powerful experience too. And if you do that right, then I think you'll earn a lot of respect from the employer community.
So we're kind of running out of time. I wanted to ask you a personal question. You are involved with Johns Hopkins, the medical school, as you mentioned, and you are on other nonprofit boards. How do you choose which nonprofit boards you want to be involved with? Are they all in education or healthcare, or do you choose more widely?
Well, it's interesting. Actually, there was once a guy, a wonderful philanthropist in Baltimore, who came and visited me, somebody I really respected, and I was probably, 20. And he said to me, "What nonprofit boards are you on?" And I didn't even know that there was such a thing. And I didn't know that anybody would ever want me on one. And this man actually literally picked a nonprofit, which was a home for troubled youth, and put me on that board. And I learned a lot, including a lot of how hard it is for so many in the world. And then that really fostered in me a desire to give back and help others. And then I ended up collecting too many board seats where I just felt like I couldn't do a good job. And then I would say to people, "You don't want me in your board. I don't have any time. I'll do a terrible job." And then they would say, "Yes, we do." And then I would prove to them that I wasn't doing a good job. So a few years ago, I went backwards and basically said, I'm only going to do a couple of things. One is where I can be a leader, which is I chair the board of something called the International Youth Foundation. And the other is I wanted to support Hopkins. They have this, not just the medical school, but what they call Johns Hopkins Medicine, which includes all their hospitals. And I am thrilled to support them, but also, like my work on the energy company board called Consolidation that I mentioned, I learned so much. I mean, this is a $10 billion nonprofit organization that's doing incredible things. So I also want to support, but always be learning as well. I do encourage everybody to try to serve on at least one nonprofit board, and encouraged a lot of my own kind of up and coming talent in Laureate to do the same.
Thank you. This has been incredible. I really appreciate you taking your time and being so candid about your background and the things you've gone through. And it's incredible the passion you've had and the great success you've had in education. And I think you were, really at the vanguard of this movement. And I wish you all the best with everything to come. Thanks again for taking the time to be with us here today.
Thank you so much. And Manish, thank you for connecting us.
Yeah, I would say, Doug, as always, I've learned many new things even in this brief period. So thank you. And that's always the case with you. And I love your daughter's quote about EBITDA, blah, blah, blah. But thank you so much for being here. And thank you, Dean Rajan and Lucas and the Polsky Center.
Yes, and Dean Rajan, I look forward to meeting you in person one day.
I look forward as well. Please come anytime you're in Chicago, or you can invite me to Aspen. I'll come and see you there.
I just wanted to say thank you to everyone for attending, and thank you to our panelists on behalf of the Polsky Center. I thought that the conversation was incredible, so thank you for your time.
It's our pleasure, Lucas. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucas. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you, Lucas. Bye-bye. Bye.